Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in today and taking time out of your schedule to um, participate in our training, cybersecurity training. I'm glad that we have the East County Economic Development Council, to provide us this wonderful training. And I'm just going to go through and let you know who we are. We are the formerly known as PTAC. Now we're Apex Accelerators is our new name, but we're still funded under the same DoD and provide the same exact services, everything's the same except for our name. Next slide, Jeremy. Those who don't know, sorry, didn't change this. We're not PTAC, but we provide one-to-one counseling, educational workshops, just like this one that we're providing to you, bid matching services, registration, certification assistance, whether you're getting certified at the federal level through Small Business Administration, your Hub Zone, your WOSB, Service Disabled Veteran Owned, or 8A certification. In addition, we also help with state certifications and certifications through NMSDC. So this is all free assistance that we can provide to you. We also assist with interpreting solicitations. What that means is that we don't write your technical or do your pricing, but what we can do is help you to understand what they're looking for in that particular solicitation. How they may be want you to write your technical, what questions they want you to answer, maybe looking at your relationships with your teaming partners. So that's the type of assistance that we can provide to you. We can also do a quick overview of your proposal to see if you've met all those points. And then also marketing to the government. And what that means is that setting up one-to-one meetings with the government. We don't market on behalf of the business because you know your business better than we do, but we can perform market research to tell you, okay, here's a list of contracting officers that buy what you sell. And so, you can reach out to them. We can do follow-up, to say, oh, did you receive their information? Just make that connection between the buyer and the small business. And then also determine suitability for contracting with agencies. And what this means is that what we can do is find out exactly what that agency is buying. For instance, I'm here in Arizona. We have IT companies that come into the state, want to sell to Luke Air Force Base, Davis-Monthan, Fort Huachuca, Yuma Proving Ground, or Yuma Marine Corps Air Station. Well, first thing that we let them know is that those contracts are procured outside of Arizona. They're usually done in Texas or on the East Coast. So if you're in construction, this is the perfect place for you to be. So those are things that we can help you to determine, what agencies are buying what is their cycle of buying at different periods throughout the fiscal year. We do service 3 BIA regions, 100%, the Northwest, which is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, the Pacific, which is the entire state of California, and the Western BIA regions, which is Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. And below is our website where we will post a recording of this training today. Next slide. And here are our office locations. Jeremy Sandoval is in our Washington office. In our California office, we have Aaron, Maurice, and Annette. I'm in the Arizona office in Chandler, and then Linda in our Oregon office. So we have 4 office locations here to provide service to you, with any questions that you may have. And as I mentioned, the services that we provide are free. And so just, for every PTAC, there is a host. The American Indian Chamber of Commerce of California is the host for our Apex Accelerator. So they have, made an investment to provide these services to you. So, and part of it is your taxpayer dollars. So you should take advantage, of, working with Apex Accelerators. Next slide. So today, I want to introduce Lindsay Sylvia. Is that how you say your last name? Sorry.
Okay,
She is
Sylvia.
okay, Sylvia. Okay, she is the project manager with the East County Economic Development Council. She is going to introduce the presenter today. So I'll hand it over to you, Lindsay.
Hi, good morning. Thank you again, Jeremy and Vanessa, for coordinating this with us. We really appreciate you letting us come in and share our information. Again, my name is Lindsay Sylvia. I'm a project manager for the San Diego East County Economic Development Council. Part of what we're here for is that we are part of a project called Cascade, which stands for the California Advanced Supply Chain Analysis and Diversification Effort, mouthful. Basically what that was is working with other partners throughout the state. We developed a cybersecurity webinar and toolkit to share with small defense businesses. That's the overall goal of the project. This was funded by the Department of Defense's Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation, known as Old CC, through the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So we have to make sure we give them some credit for all the help they've provided us. And we're excited to be part of working with you folks today because yes, we're California, but we are excited to share with other states as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Olivier. Mike is a cybersecurity expert for our organization. He also is a consultant for the San Diego Orange County PTAC slash Apex Accelerator, as well as our Small Business Development Center down south. So he's a great resource, and we'll be sharing. I'm going to put my email into the chat. One last note is we are also part of this project is working with the El Camino Community College here in Southern California on a community of practice. They're building an online portal to offer free and very or low cost services for cybersecurity. We will be putting out a beta test, and part of that is inviting some small defense companies to come and maybe participate. So if you're interested, please email me and we can talk further. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. Let me pull up the screen here and we'll get into it, as they say. So let me know if everyone can see that. So we're in sync here. All right. So this is the agenda. We'll talk about what the goal is or some terminology. Like any industry, cybersecurity has its own language. It can be confusing. Obviously, these terms describe the obvious, but that's the way it is, right? What are those threats to small business, which is why are we having this conversation? And then I want to talk about compliance. And don't think of compliance as just for the government, and compliance is in all industries, to most all industries. And as you are in business and as you are working within industry sectors, you're going to run into all kinds of compliance requirements. And there's compliance requirements for system security or cybersecurity in just about all industries. So this is just not a one-off thing. So now you have all that information. And so the next question is, okay, what can you do to prepare your business? What are those simple things you can do to get ready for an assessment or compliance audit or whatever it is that you're going to need to do, self-certify most likely for your small business here. So again, the goal of the training is to learn what you can do to reduce the vulnerabilities for your business. Obviously, we live in a very dangerous world in terms of cybersecurity. I don't have to tell you about that. Everyone probably knows somebody or has had a personal experience where their information has gotten stolen or hacked or whatever the situation may be. So the importance of education is often overlooked because people think about these tools that they can use, but 90% of all successful hacks are through email. So think about that. So how do you prevent that? Well, you need to educate your employees, the people that you're associated with, your partners, business partners, and keep that thought in the forefront of your mind here as we go through this. Is that again, 90% of all these attacks come through email. So how you recognize them, how you set up your system, how you think about defense within your system in layers is all important. And then again, the third thing is these walkaways that you can use to implement with your system. So some of the terminology that's bandied about is cyber hygiene. That's just instituting cyber best practices like access control and things of that nature. cyber posture, those defensive actions that you take to protect your system. And the third thing here is cyber compliance. And those we talked a little bit about that. And those are the things that you need to do in order to meet compliance requirements, whether you're in the medical industry, if you're in the financial business, as you're doing defense work with the government as a contractor, all these require some sort of cybersecurity or system security compliance. So what's the threat to small businesses? Why are we here? So on average, cyber costs are now costing companies about $200,000. Personally, I think that's a little bit inflated, but it's a big number, even if you're a small company. Generally, the numbers I've seen are in the low $20,000, but most small businesses cannot afford $20,000 out of the pocket. So it becomes a moot point after that. So most small businesses that are hacked go out of business within 6 months. And again, many of these breaches are aimed at small business. And the reason is because small business don't have all these resources that large companies have. You don't have an IT staff. You don't have all these sophisticated hardware and software programs working to protect your system. Nevertheless, there are small, simple things that you can do to protect your business. And those small, simple things that you do to protect your business are oftentimes things that the larger businesses don't do. Large businesses with tens of thousands of people working in IT companies oftentimes forget to close ports. They forget to do simple things that a small business could do as a matter of course. So again, just don't think you're at a disadvantage here of not having all these resources, because if you're doing the small things that we talk about here, you're going to be way ahead of the power curve. The important point is you're not too small or too unappealing to not be a target. So that's really the thing that we want to think about. So here's a couple of examples. There's a company called Patco Construction. They had a malware attack. Someone came in. Again, this is through email. Someone answered some email. Someone downloaded some malware onto their computer. There weren't any internal controls or wasn't any access control, and they cleared out their bank account. So they had to sue their bank, and eventually they got their money back. But again, it took a long period of time. Not many people could afford to lose $500,000 out of their operating account. So another one, smaller scale here, but this is more common than not. Small company that does travel services for adventure and eco type tourism. So again, only $14,000 out of their credit card, but that's still a lot of money if you're a small business. Again, an email attack where they clicked on something and they're able to get access to their account. There wasn't any sort of segmentation in their system that we'll talk about here. And again, they had to go back to their bank and try to get their money. And eventually they did, but it was a long, drawn out process and something that you don't want to do. You have better things to do. You're running your company, right? So where do these threats come from? Well, think of them as a triad, if you will. We have nation state actors, criminal networks, and independent actors. They all kind of work together and against each other. It just kind of depends upon what's going on. Nation state actors, of course, are China. Iran is another one. North Korea is the second or third. And then, of course, Russia. There's also smaller companies that are involved in this. Criminal networks are those folks that send you email that your uncle wants to send you $1 million, has gas oil leases in Nigeria. We're most familiar with these Nigerian criminal gangs, criminal networks, and they prey upon people. They're pretty much throughout South America, many countries in South America, and of course Africa is also a good place for that. And the Russia. Interesting, the Chinese, and we'll get to this, have a huge number of people, and oftentimes they freelance in these criminal networks and provide support for them. And then we get to the independent actors, and these may be, just a young kid or a seasoned veteran of this. They'll sell their services to the criminals networks. They'll sell their services to these nation state actors. So you have really a business, a huge international ecosystem of criminals that spend every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to hack into your network. So This is the real deal, as they say, and that is billions of dollars of losses a year. One of the basis one, of course, is the Chinese cyber army. So by cyber army, we mean about 200,000 people. Now think of that, 200,000 people whose full-time job is to hack into U.S. institutions, hack into businesses, hack into industry, the government, and so on and so forth. And oftentimes they'll hack into a small business in order to get access to a larger subcontractor, and then into the government. So if they can get your resources, get your credentials, you have some sort of automatic payment set up with one of your prime contractors, that's certainly what they want to do. Of course, as they go up the food chain here, it gets a little bit, there are more defensive mechanisms. But nevertheless, if they can shut down the small businesses within the industrial base here in the United States, then it could have dire consequences. But again, we're looking at 200,000 people. I mean, that's the real thing. So what do they have in common in terms of your business? Is the ability or the desire to hit the easiest targets. And of course, those are small businesses because there's not that much protection. And as I mentioned earlier, you look at large companies, large corporations, often in these fundamentals are not much better. As an example, we had the SolarWinds attack a few years ago. They were able to infiltrate systems within the government. They're looking at critical infrastructure. And the way they got through was someone had put in a password for a firewall called the password they used was SolarWind123. Not terribly clever. So again, this is a huge corporation whose business is cybersecurity. Colonial Pipeline was another example. Misconfigured firewall, it certainly happens frequently. But again, they were able to hack into the Colonial Pipeline and stop the delivery of gasoline and oil, bulk fuel products into New England. And there's cases where gas stations ran out of gasoline because of the distribution, or I should say, the delivery mess that this whole thing called. But again, these are large companies suffering these failures because they're not doing the simple, basic things right. So how do they attack? Again, as I mentioned earlier, 90% of that is through email. There's a thing in the industry called social engineering. Great example of this is the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center, the IC3. They have a new report out in 2021, and they talk about this. Social engineering essentially is understanding who you are and using that information that you have on your Facebook page, using that information that you have on your LinkedIn page against you. And so what does that mean? Well, they understand, or you talk about how you love to go fishing. I'm just using an example here, and you belong to these fishing chat groups or websites, whatever. Well, they'll strike up a conversation with you about fishing and talking about different things, and then get to know you and send you some pictures, and you download that stuff, and then again you got malware and off to the races. So social engineering is a very, very powerful thing. The amazing thing is for large hacks, if you will, they'll spend hours and hours, maybe weeks or months, developing a plan of attack, integrating themselves within the environment, talking to people, trying to gain their trust and confidence, as they say, in order to execute their hack and get into your system. So these are professionals. When you think about it, as I mentioned, there's an industry out there. And those industry members, many of them are not just some guy in a boiler room or some woman in a boiler room in India. They are professionals that are looking to get what they want and using social engineering as a tool to do that. So here's some of the information from the FBI Internet Complaint Center. This is from 2021. So that first one is business email compromise and email account compromise, 1.8 billion That was just in 1 year that was reported. Most of these reports are from the United States, probably 90% of them. The second one I thought was kind of interesting is confidence romance fraud. This is for people pretending that they're not who they are. That is falls way bent down there by only 600 million. Investment fraud is 300, close to 340 million, and then ransomware at about 29 million. And again, this is what's reported. So the actual numbers are probably twice that amount. So think about that. So this is not a trivial stuff here. Again, as I mentioned, social engineering is how they target you. And it's no longer this broadcast email, the rich prince who wants to send you millions of dollars. There's a process, there's a professional element to this. The files are developed and held on you based on who you are, especially by the Chinese and the Russians. The Communist Party in China, CCP, Chinese Communist Party, has files and social profiles on their own citizen, and they also have those files and profile files on people in other country, namely United States. So if you've been in your industry for a while, if you've certainly been in the military, if you were in politics or some position of authority or responsibility, there's a good chance that you have a file on you. It was the Chinese that were behind the Office of Personnel Management attack a few years ago, where they basically were able to cut or copy, I should say, all the OPM files for people that have security clearances. So they have that as part of their social profile and backlog of information on people. Now, they may never use this, but if you are somehow tagged as a person of interest to them, they will use that information to try to, basically have you download a file that has malware so they could take over your computer or other things like that. So the more they know about you, the easier it is to develop a campaign against you. So, the thing is, well, I want to talk about things we're doing on Facebook and LinkedIn and how wonderful things are and how great we are. So think about what you put out there is the real point of this slide here. Think about what you put on social media, because that all could come back to haunt you. It's this fine dance between too much information and not enough information. And only you are the best judge of that. Again, why is it so easy? Well, your small companies don't have a lot of resources. There's no policies. There's no procedures. Access is easy because of poor passwords. We looked at SolarWinds 123. That's certainly not a great passwords for a company called SolarWinds. The other thing is no multi-factor authentication. That's what MFA is. So within the world of Google, when you're talking hundreds or tens of millions of users, maybe approaching hundreds of millions, I don't know, certainly a lot. Only 80% use multi-factor authentication. So if you use multi-factor authentication, you're way ahead of everybody else. And remember, I mean, these people aren't going to go after the more difficult targets. They're going to go after easy targets. And an easy target would be one with no MFA. Second thing is outdated software. I mean, a lot of times we get these software updates for new features, and they also update vulnerabilities. As they develop software, there's errors and problems within their code for a whole host of reasons. And as they go through and fix these errors, there's updates to their software. So you need to make sure that your software that you're using, whether that's the Microsoft's or Apple or software, all is of the latest version. And what you just need to do is turn that on. I know it's a little annoying. You got to reboot your computer or restart your computer, but this is certainly better than living with outdated software and making yourself a vulnerability. The third thing is uncontrolled access, no segmentation. Those last two examples of that, those two companies, the construction company and the travel agency, they had universal access. That means once they compromised one person, got their credentials, then it was very simple to get to their bank account. So what you need to do is look at the structure of your company, and we'll talk about this later, and see how that's organized. No one person, or better yet, no one set of credentials, no one password, or whatever should have access to everything. So you need to have multiple passwords, particularly for sensitive information, especially I should say, for your system administration. So most people just use one password, gives them access to their system administration, so they can add devices. The other thing is so they could, answer email, do work. You really need to have two. You need to have one specifically set up for as system administrator and one specifically set up as a user. So again, that was just another layer of protection there. So business compliance, we talked about that a little bit. Before I go into this is kind of the break here, any questions from anyone that we've over the information we covered so far? I can go off mic here and just ask your questions if you want at this point in time. Otherwise, we'll move forward here. Okay, business compliance. So if you're in business, you'll need to address compliance. So what are we talking about? Well, all businesses basically have some sort of compliance requirement. Again, we have the payment card industry, PCI data security standards. So if you take payment through credit cards, most likely as a small business, you're using a service provider who charges you a fee. Well, one of the reasons they charge you that fee is they have to be compliant with this industry standard about securing the information of the card holders and that card information. Again, you don't want this stuff in the public domain. So how you do that? Well, you have standards for compliance that you need to follow in order to prevent that, or would certainly reduce the possibility of a leakage of information. So just one example of these standards that surround our business life here. And of course, the large primes, if you will, the large payment card holders, again, all are part of this standard called PCI, Payment Card Industry Compliance or Data Security Standard. Another one that we're probably more familiar with is Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And this is to safeguard patient files and information. Actually, your healthcare information is more profitable or more valuable to a criminal than just a credit card information. They can get a lot of more money out of a false or stolen Medicare record. So again, that's why we have HIPAA, or that's why HIPAA is part of that industry. Very stringent standards. You have to be audited once a year. There's many things that are similar between these industry standards. But again, this is not a trivial thing here if you're in the healthcare industry. Another example is the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. This is to safeguard financial information. So if you're involved in financial transactions as a broker or home loans, car loans, often these things are brokered through other larger entities, banks, but all those banks that you borrow money from have to meet these requirements. Again, some of those things are very common: access control rules, system security planning, and so on and so forth. The next one is more probably important to most people here, is the CMMC, or Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. This is actually a requirement that came out in 2016. The requirement was by December 31st, 2017, that if you dealt, particularly within the Department of Defense, with controlled and classified information, you had to attest that you had met all 320 of these requirements. And that was a level 2 thing. So after that, it was pretty much ignored by industry. The government came back and said, well, we're being ignored here. We need to do something about it. And they came up with this construct called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, which will have a couple different levels. Actually, there's 3 different levels. Level 1 will be the most common. This is incorporating 17 base requirements with about 59 other what they call assessment objectives. Level 2, we'll talk about this a little bit more, much more involved, 110 base requirements with 320 assessment objectives. So if you're going to be awarded a defense contract as a prime or subcontractor, you're going to have this compliance. And again, level 1 is self-certification. Level 2 will be an on-site assessment or an assessment through a third-party auditor. So again, you'll need to self-assess for what they call federal contract information or on-site audit if you have controlled unclassified information. And you have to demonstrate compliance. And they're going to look at this in terms of compliance. They're going to look at whether you, by examination, and that could be looking at documentation, compliance screenshots and things like that. Interview your personnel, people that are working in this area, or they may test your system. So this is going to be a real thing. So within the construct, there's federal contract information called FCI. As I mentioned, there's 17 requirements and 59 assessment objectives. This is the base that all contractors that work within the, not even beyond the Department of Defense, within the federal government, you're supposed to be compliant with these 17 requirements. So if you do work with the Department of Homeland Security or Department of Justice, Department of Transportation, you're supposed to be compliant with that. Now, if you work within the Department of Defense, you need to be FCI compliant as well. Now, if you also get controlled unclassified information, it's a higher level. That's 110 requirements with 320 assessment objectives. So the level 2 is going to require a certification or an audit that you're going to have to pay for. And compliance is meeting all 320 of those assessment objectives. And so you just can't get, above 80% of those assessment objectives to get full compliance. And you must demonstrate your compliance. And they're going to look at the adequacy and sufficiency of the evidence that you bring to bear for those requirements. So is the evidence that you have, adequate? Does it cover the requirement? And there is enough of it, sufficiency in that regard, that covers all the objectives. So there, if you have environments with Windows systems and Apple systems, if you will, Mac systems, they're going to look at both of those types of things. They're just not going to look at one computer. So the big thing about this is you must document your compliance, and you must have what's called a system security plan. Now, as I mentioned, there's other requirements like HIPAA and PCI DSS and SOX Sarbanes. All those compliance frameworks require a system security plan. So this is nothing new. So if you're going to look at this as part of your business, you need to start looking at how you construct a system security plan, what if it's components. And one thing I might want to mention right now is that it's not an IT plan. It's not a plan on how you implement your information management system. It's a holistic approach to securing your business. And that includes physical protection, personnel security, configuration management, risk management, a whole number of other domains that you would have to put in place and support and actually implement. They're going to want to see documentation that you're actually having configuration management meetings, documentation that you've had a risk management or a risk assessment meeting in as part of your plan. So one of the things you really need to think about is, can you survive, or do you want to go through all this paperwork and process? And these are all overhead functions. I mean, you're not getting paid for this. This is coming out of your overhead for your company. So again, it's something to think about is, you dabble around these things. Now, obviously not everybody in business is going to have these protections. Not every company is going to require it. So if you're someone who does framing for buildings, this is probably not going to be a requirement. But if you're someone who builds a contractor that is involved in building critical infrastructure within the United States, for example, dealing with water or gas or electricity, then these things may be applicable. So we talk about so far, what's the threat, the reason for all these requirements, some of those compliance requirements. And so one of the things that people want to know, what's the point here? How can I make myself more secure? So what are those things that I can do to help prepare my company for an eventual audit, or just make it more secure so it's less likely to be attacked. Well, think of security as a holistic approach. As I mentioned, it's just not IT. It's looking at all these other things that come into play to secure your information. So before you even start with that, you got to look at this as a process. And the part of the process begins with knowing what you have. This is knowing what you have in terms of your hardware, knowing what you have in terms of where your information is stored. Now, think about this. I mean, all we hear is these horror stories of the hospital dumping, patient records in the dumpster and some guy retrieving them in the middle of the night. Certainly, it doesn't happen as much as before because of the changes here, but those things apply to you too. So if you have financial information about your company, personal information about your company, where you store that and how you dispose of that is important. So you got to know what you got before you can even figure out how you're going to get rid of it. So it's just more than your IT infrastructure. It's more than your computers. It's where that information is that you need to protect. And consider that your information has a life cycle. Just like you have a bank statement, it's good for this month, next month, probably not so great. I mean, in terms of its importance to you. So as you get rid of those things, how do you get rid of them? So as you have computers and they become end of life, how do you get rid of them? So knowing what you have, knowing how you're going to manage that's all related to developing and implementing a plan. So your plan has to have this holistic approach of controlling what you have, controlling things throughout their life cycle, and then sustaining your plan. And this is kind of the more difficult thing because you just got to schedule these meetings where you go back and say, okay, let's make sure there's no changes to our system. Let's make sure that everyone has all the rights and privileges that they need to do their job and adjust accordingly. And the list goes on. So this sustainment thing is another thing that people kind of don't think about. It's kind of like exercise. Just because you had a good workout one day doesn't mean you're done for the rest of your life. This is a continuous process. So know what you have is looking at the inventory of your system, and of course, is the software up to date. We mentioned that as a great vulnerability. It's about managing and controlling access to your computer system, managing and controlling access to your system configuration. So know where your routers are, know where all these things are. They in a secure environment? If they're in your house, they're probably pretty secure. If you work in one of these office spaces where everything is out in the open and you're sharing access with all these other companies, with these people that you don't know anything about, well then guess what? You got a problem. So think about knowing what you have is more than just inventory more stuff. It's knowing the status and the health of all these devices and making sure that these things are up to date. So the basis of knowing what you have is that inventory and controlling your system, and controlling the system is, again, making sure these things are under configuration management control. And what does that mean? That means you are in charge of the configuration and you're managing it, and you're not letting people add things or take things off your network. So you're controlling that. Think of this as your network in an office environment, even at your house, as a place where you live. You just don't let random people come into your house. You don't let random people move your furniture around. You should take that same type of ownership over your network and computers, and look at where the information goes. Again, do you need your cell phones to have access to everything? Do you need printers, to be able to print all these things? Again, we're talking about is controlling physical as well as electronic media. So make sure that you have control over your system. So the last bullet here, no one can add or take anything from the system without approval. Essentially, you have positive control over your system. Again, that is configuration management control. So the other thing about knowing what you have is use these controls to protect your business. Require you to change default passwords when you get an access point or other types of devices. They're going to come with the manufacturer's default password. You need to change that. as soon as you can. Restrict access to these controls. So understand that most all the controls, when you look at the PCI requirements, HIPAA, Fox, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, all those are requirements to physically control access and to electronically control access to information. So if you look at this as about all the ways you can control access to your system and your information, will give you much better understanding of the things that you need to do. The last point here is control physical documents and devices throughout their life cycle. So if you have a thumb drive, you just don't want to throw that in the trash. You want to destroy it. You want to make sure that no one can retrieve that data. Same as with a removable drive or CDs and things of that nature. Same as with paper documents. You want to make sure those are shredded appropriately or burned so they can't be recognized and information can't be gleaned from them. So here's some examples of assessments that you can use. There's a critical infrastructure cybersecurity community, if you will. This is again by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And this is a program that you can subscribe to and we'll run an assessment. Now, bear in mind that when I go through these tools here, they don't really do anything to your system. You're just answering questions. And so it's very involved. You really have to know what you're doing here. And it will, at the end of the day, provide a report of where you need to focus your efforts on. And so you get through this, you'll be able to zero in on those areas where you're most vulnerable. Another one is the Critical Resilience Review. This is developed by Carnegie Mellon, the Software Engineering Institute. Again, it's very involved. It can take a few hours, but again, it'll give you the ability to drill down and to see where those vulnerabilities are. And so you can sort of rank them and have a very structured way to address the vulnerabilities in your system. So a couple of tools here. This will be in the presentation that you'll have access to. So what is the real basic thing about here is know what you have and control access to what you have. So this sounds pretty simple, but there's a lot of nuances to what you have. So some of those nuances are establishing role-based access control, making sure people have only the information they need to do their job. So basically, you are restricting access to hardware and to information, and you're allowing access to that hardware information to only the people that need to use it to complete their job. This requires some sort of structure, requires you to set up role-based access control and other structures as well. The second thing is ensure there's no universal access to data and physical information resources. So what does that mean? That not everyone uses the same password. Not everyone uses the same physical key to get into the building. Not everyone uses the same keypad with the same 6-digit number, whatever that may be. You need to make sure that you can identify user access, because if you can't identify user access, then you really don't have much access control. And the last bullet here, even for a one user company, you should have separate access. One is a system administrator, and the second as a user, which means you have 2 login credentials. And if you do that, you'll be much further along than those 2 companies that we talked about earlier, the construction company and the travel agency. So what happened? I never read the report, but I can pretty much tell you what happened. Someone downloaded email. They're able to compromise that person that had the email. They're able to get access to his system because he had administrative rights. And then since he had or she had administrative rights, they were able to access the bank account because why there wasn't any separation in user access. And once they had access to their bank account, well, then it was all over. So again, it's just segmenting and separating of roles is very important. So once you have that, you need to develop and implement your plan. So when you got your inventory, you know what you have, everything's up to date, you know where it is physically in the environment, how things are connected. So you're implementing your plan. How are you going to protect your information? So you need to establish company standards for data access and security. Again, with the things we talked about, password complexity and length, longer is better. You know, making sure your data is encrypted. So if someone steals the data from the outside, they get basically nothing. Ensuring you have multi-factor authentication turned on. For small companies, I recommend that you back up your system and air gap the backup. That means you take a removable drive or a small removable drive, connect it to your system, back everything down, and then physically disconnect it to your system. I suggest you use 2 drives. So you have 1 drive for odd months and 1 drive for even months. And so the most damage you could suffer is a loss of maybe 60 days. Simple things you could do. You just got to get it done. So another things that's standards that you could do is looking at antivirus software, making sure that it's up to date, requiring employees and system users to sign an acceptable use policy. This is important because if you have users on your system and on your network, you need to monitor the behavior. An acceptable use policy is something an employee or user would sign saying, hey, I understand that my actions on this network will be monitored. And as a precondition for accessing this, I understand that these things will happen. So again, it gets you out of that legal hot water. And it also establishes what people can and can't do. So if people are doing things that are not appropriate, you can refer to the acceptable use policy and say, okay, this is something you signed that you wouldn't do, and here you're doing it. So obviously we need to do something. There has to be some consequence. Set a standard where you're establishing system checks throughout the year and then establishing rules to add equipment to your system. It depends upon how your environment is, but you know, most systems are not going to pose a threat. However, you need to have some process. We have assurance that the equipment that you're getting, those devices that you're getting, are not going to cause harm to your system. Bring your own device policies and processes. This is about cell phones, laptops, and things like that that people may bring to their office environment. So how do you handle that? Oh, well, let me just say they shouldn't have access to your network. You should set up a guest network within your environment. What you want to do is, again, restrict access to information, restrict access to those products that help you run your system. And so if you have people just logging in randomly, then obviously that's not being accomplished and you are at great risk. So the other thing is establish this culture of cyber hygiene, compliance, and training. So you know what your requirements are. I mean, where do you fall in that compliance hierarchy? Is this a HIPAA? Is it CMMC? Is it NIST 800-171? I mean, there's a whole host of things. Understanding what those are. You know, this may be a requirement by regulation. Your insurance company may require this. So you have to have some evidence of compliance or evidence that you can comply. And a good example of that would be a system security plan. Have cyber awareness training. Have your team attend cyber awareness training. Again, training your employees on how to recognize email, what to do if there's an incident, are very important and will save you money in the long run. So the last thing is sustain your plan. This is what's going to cost the most over time when you really think about it. So understand that this is a life cycle process and you need to look at your plan and adjustment as needed. And conduct periodic assessments. I mean, you don't have to do this once a week or even once a month, but somehow go out there and ensure that those things, those policies and procedures and practices that you've implemented are providing those desired results, that they're implemented as they should be. And again, you're getting that benefit from them as you need. So this is a cyclic process that basically never ends. So sustainment It's the owner's responsibility, and it's something that can't be outsourced. So you need to sustain your hardware and software system, replace them when they're at end of life, configure them properly, resource them, make sure that they have the other components as practical that they need to execute their programs here. So system software needs to be updated. You needs to have a patch management program. I mean, these things you just turn on automatically, but sometimes folks turn them off. Software access configuration control. That means essentially that you only a certain number of people, a very exclusive or limited number of people have the ability to get into your system admin and change access for individuals within the company. I mean, that could certainly cause a lot of consternation. So train, as we mentioned that, again, the 90% of all attacks come via email. And the reason is people just don't know what to do. They click on the suspicious email and off they go. So you need to train them to recognize a suspicious email. There's certainly things that those folks do that kind of give them away. So monitor system activity and users. This is a management issue here. So you need to set up those controls to begin with and then actually implement them. And have this acceptable use policy that says there's no expectation of privacy. So you're using company resources. You should be doing them to do a job, not sit there and look for the latest sale on the internet or email people about silly stuff. I mean, these should be company focused, company driven, in making sure your employees understand that is an important step in achieving that company focused approach to your information management system. So simple things you can do now. Make sure your software is up to date. We talked about this. Antivirus software is important. Operating system, your router. Establish multi-factor authentication. Be that 20% that is using it, and you'll find yourself being more secure and less likely to be attacked. Don't use free anything. Here's a good point. Oftentimes people will give out free thumb drives or USB devices, and they contain malware. So they'll contain some program that you want, but it's also malware. So the minute they stick that in your in your computer, the malware is downloaded and begins to take over your system. So things that are too good to be true certainly are in this case, right? And then change the default settings on everything. So if you have routers, doorbells, whatever the case may be, they all have setup instructions. They have standards that they use so you can get into the system. But once you've set that system up, make sure you change those standards. Make sure you change those default settings. And this is all part of this last one here is part of configuration management control, controlling your system just like you do where you live, right? Talking about passwords. This is an interesting chart I ran across, and we have purple, red, kind of orange, gold, if you will, and green. And so this is illustrates the advantage of the number of characters in a password. And essentially, what we're talking about is password complexity. The longer it is, the more complex, the harder it is to hack that password. So for a 7-character password, was just using upper and lowercase letters, like a sentence that you would normally write, it's going to take someone 2 seconds to hack into that system. Think about that, just using regular text, 2 seconds, that's hardly measurable. Of course, the longer, the better. A 12-character password, you're looking at upper and lowercase letters, where it took as instantly as now 24 years. So again, that's just illustrates the point that password complexity needs to be part of your system here. So what did we talk about? We talked about the 3 pillars of system security, how it's important for you to know what you have, and know where the condition of that equipment, making sure it's up to date, and where it's located, making sure that's not a threat. And it's not only your computer equipment, but also paper documents and physical information. Develop and implement your plan. Make sure that you have a plan that is sustainable, that you have a plan that you can support over time. And don't do things that you don't have to do. Make your plan simple, make it something that you can work with. So, a lot of times folks will go in, yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to get this inside of our network. And then when they look at the cost of that in terms of labor and supporting it, it becomes quite different. And that gets to the last bullet here. Make sure you have the ability to sustain your plan. So again, simple things you can do: back up your system, air gap it, like I mentioned, disconnect it from your system, control access like you would control access to your home. Have those separate logins. One is a system administrator, one is an actual worker on your system. For multi-user systems, segment access to systems and resources. Not everyone should have access to the system administrator. Not everyone needs access to your financial data. So here are some resources. Of course, there's one-on-one counseling that Lindsay mentioned. Some of these things here are certainly something you may want to take advantage of, and they're all free. Download them. This will be provided. That is the end of the presentation. I know it was a lot of information. So let me know if there's any questions that I can help answer for anybody. Nothing?
Oh, Mike, this is Vanessa. I have a question for you. Now, when somebody is doing a level 1, the self-assessment, is that something that you can provide, or do you suggest that, is there a place where a company can do that?
Well, I mean,
Self-assessment.
yeah, that's a great question, Vanessa. I think a self-assessment is can get confusing. I mean, but essentially it means that company self-certifies, and this has to be done by a corporate officer in the company, and this is important consideration. It has to be a corporate officer, and this portal will occur is yet to be built yet. And they'll say, yes, we're doing these things. And the self-assessment at level 1 is pretty simple. It's 59. It's essentially 59 things. And some of those 59 things are things like, do you have visitor control? In other words, when visitors show up at your office, do you have them log in? Do you escort them? Do you make sure that you have this log that you keep control of? That you identify visitors and so on and so forth. So those are things that most people do anyway. But again, you have to institutionalize that and make sure that you have a description of the tasks involved. So it requires some documentation. But the point is that to your question was that the company officer, corporate officer, will have to say, yea, verily, we're doing these things. And they don't really, I mean, we can provide support for that, but it's all done. It's all in the onus of that company. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does answer my question. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anything else?
Mike, this is Jo Marie.
Hey, Jo Marie.
Can you just mention a little bit about the fact that there are a whole lot of predatory providers out there who are going to tell you that they'll give you one stop checklist to getting through CMMC at any level, and that the buyer should beware.
Right. So good point. Good point, Jo Marie. There is a thing called the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Accreditation Body. Actually, they changed their name to Cyber AB. Excuse me, Cyber CYBERAB. And there is a list of companies that have gone through a certification process. Now, you can have anyone you want help you become compliant with level 1, level 2. It doesn't really matter. However, to answer Jo Marie's point here is that some people I know most all of us have run into this problem where you meet someone in business and they seem like they know what they're talking about. But when you get down to it, they're clueless. And so that often occurs. And that also occurs in the cyber business, shockingly, maybe. And so in order to have a marketplace where people that are accredited, there's one on the Cyber AB website, and it's resource providers that you can look. And it's there's a list of them. I think there's a couple thousand resource provider organizations now within the CMMC ecosystem. So that's one good place to look for that. But again, there's no prohibition that you don't have to use these people. You can use one or more or none. But you need to be an educated consumer in this regard. What I have found, just as an aside here, is most larger companies will use a managed service provider. And the managed service provider will say, oh, yeah, we're doing all that stuff. We got it covered. But when I talk to the managed service provider, they're really not documenting things. They're not recording things, and they're not being complete in their implementation of the controls. And so, your managed service provider may be a great guy or gal, but be leery when they automatically just jump up and say, "Don't worry about it. We got it covered." I mean, you really need to look into that because what's the expression? The devil's in the details, and they may be doing some of these things, but not completely. Gets back to what we talked about earlier when you look at evidence. So your evidence is going to be a documentation, an interview, or a test. And in that evidence, it has to cover the requirement. In other words, that has to cover the requirement adequately. And it has to cover the requirement sufficiently in terms of scale or scope. So think of those things. And a lot of times the MSPs are just being quick and not really getting into that adequacy as much as I think they should. Some of them are pretty good, but it's something, food for thought. So Mike Brandon, I'm going to pick on you. You got anything or any questions I can help you with?
Yes, sir. I'm looking at DoD as a potential market to vend goods. I've been fencing materials. And so I was doing some research, and is it the entire supply chain that needs to be compliant? I mean, is it all the way down to the manufacturer as far as being a vendor?
At level 1, the answer is yes.
And so how would a individual report that, to
Well, you would, so that part is yet to be worked out. Well, let me back up and say this. So I'm going to change what I said. So most people, let me put it this way, the simplest way I can put it is, if you have a direct contract with the federal government, it means you are the contract awardee. You have to be level 1. Now, if you're the supplier to that person that won the contract, then you don't have to be, as long as you're not getting what's called federal contract information. So if you have a federal contract with the federal government, you have contract information. It's a federal contract, therefore you have federal contract information. So you got to be level 1, and that's the 17 things I mentioned, or 17 major requirements. But if you're a supplier and you never get FCI, federal contract information, from your prime, then it's not required. So, I mean, you really kind of have to look at where the information is. You got to follow the information. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So if you are a supplier to somebody as a second or third tier contractor to a prime, that prime should be doing its due diligence and making sure that you're not getting federal contract information. Why they would send it to you, I don't know, unless there's some particular set of circumstances, but they need to protect you from all these regulations. And so the question is, where does the FCI go? Well, it should go to the contract holder and stay there. At least that's, but everything's different. So hard to give a blanket there. That help?
Yes.
Okay. Is anyone else I can? Aaron, how about you? Anything? Melissa? You guys put in fake names. I can't call you. So
Some of them don't have sound, so they should just, if you don't have any sound, please just post it in the chat.
there you
And
go.
then Mike will be able to read it.
Yeah. We have anything here?
Yeah. So Mike, I have a question for you. This is
Yes.
Vanessa. And my question is there a follow-on training to this training that kind of goes more in depth with the cybersecurity?
You'd have to talk to
Talk
my
to Lindsay?
Lindsay, yeah,
Okay.
my adult supervisor. She can help that.
Yeah, I think Lindsay,
Okay.
the answer Lindsay has is yes, so.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
so we do that. I mean, but you just have to, I coordinate through Lindsay. So,
Okay. Thank you.
all right, no worries. So anyone else? Okay, well, thank you. I guess if no further questions, no sense
Mike.
hanging it out, right? That's all I have if there are any more questions. So Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you and Vanessa.
I
Thank
don't have
you.
any additional comments, but yes, if somebody is interested, I had shared my chat, my email. I'll do it again. I also actually, in the chat, I also added some handouts that are really good, additional information that hands you to additional resources. It kind of breaks down terminology for CMMC a little bit further, and just kind of adds on to everything Mike went with today. There's also, I'm not going to call it a checklist, but there's a what you should be doing now list, ways for you to just kind of start being proactive in getting yourself prepared. So check those out. And again, please reach out to us. We have partners in this project work that are providing much more in-depth training. And because it's through a grant with the governor's office, they are predominantly funded. So they would be very little cost to you. So if you're interested, those can be multiple hours or multiple days, depending on what you need. And we also ask or recommend talk to CMTC if you're already contacted with them or connected with them. If not, either ourselves or I'm sure Jeremy and Vanessa have that as well.
Yes.
But yeah, there's a lot of additional trainings out there that you can receive at little to no cost through our resources. So please let us know if you need help.
Yes. And I would just like to thank Lindsay and Mike for providing this training for us today. And we will be in contact with their office to provide, additional training on cybersecurity, because, what I can say is that it is going to implement small businesses. So it's not going to go away. They will be start showing up in contracts, both at the state level, of course, at the federal level, but we're also seeing it with some of the in the commercial side. So it's good information that businesses need to be aware of. And, like I said, I just really appreciate you providing us this training today.
Thank you. Before we sign off here, Aaron had a great question. The question is, how successful has the U.S. military been preventing cyber attacks? Go ahead. Each branch has its own counter cyber resources. Well, so when the war in Ukraine started, what was the threat, right? The threat was that the Russians would attack the Ukrainian infrastructure, shut down their economy. The Russians would also attack the United States infrastructure and shut down the economy. And that hasn't happened. Now, there's also things going on every day. So I think the U.S. posture is certainly much improved than it has been, and it's getting better. A lot of money is being invested in this. And of course, what we're talking about is part of that defensive posture. So sometimes I think we beat ourselves up a little bit. Sometimes that's necessary, sometimes perhaps not. But if you look at the dire threats that I saw coming out at when the Russians invaded the Ukraine, and they were talking about how the U.S. infrastructure would be soon brought to its knees by the Russians. Never happened, right? So anything else? Someone else had a comment? Well, that's all I have. Thank you, Vanessa and Lindsay.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
All right.
Have a
Bye,
nice day,
Jerry.
everybody, and happy,
Okay.
or have a nice President's Day.
Well,
next
that's right.
week.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Out here. Bye.